first time I played the Mass Effect trilogy was back in early 2020, when the world was being locked down because of a certain pandemic. I streamed the trilogy live on Twitch over a couple months and had a lot of fun, and by the end my opinion was, yeah, they're pretty good games. But for a long time I was confused about the love people had for it. I know there's a bunch of people who regard the games as some of the best they've ever played, especially Mass Effect 2, but I found my experience with the trilogy to be just decent. However, in February of 2023, out of nowhere I got the itch to replay the story. I'd honestly forgotten a lot of it, and I know there were some side missions and DLC I never actually played. So I bought the Legendary Edition, installed a few mods to make the game slightly prettier, and I began what I didn't realise would be a nearly 200-hour journey over the next few months. And let's just say the trilogy went from being decent to entering my top 10 favourite games of all time. It sounds strange to say, but looking back to my first playthrough, I was playing it completely wrong. Some of it has to do with the fact that I was live streaming. Even though I'd get between 3 and 10 viewers, I was constantly aware I was being watched, and so my mind was way too focused on playing as best I could and keeping things entertaining. That meant I skipped some side content to keep the story going, and with every choice, I just chose whatever felt the most efficient, rather than what I actually wanted to choose. What didn't help is that viewers told me it's best to stick to either Paragon or Renegade choices, and not to do a bit of both, or else I'd be locked out of more choices down the road. Which is true, but because of this, my Shepard was completely Paragon no matter what, and it honestly wasn't satisfying. From what I've seen online, there's a lot of people who tell new players to stick to one side, and I truly believe that's not how these games should be played. Now, before I start going through the 3 games and going through spoilers, I'll give a quick bullet point list of how I learned to love the trilogy, so if you're like me and thought they were just okay, or if you've never played them before, take note. I chose who my Shepard should be and made choices based on that, ignoring the wrong idea that blue choices equal good and red choices equal bad. I played through all content and talked to the NPCs as much as possible. I looked up what order to play the DLC in, because this just helped with the flow of the narrative. I actually read about the lore and species in the galaxy, as it's actually really interesting. I wasn't afraid to restart a save if I picked a dialogue option that didn't sound right for my Shepard. And finally, I embraced the idea that BioWare made the story, but I'm the one who's in charge of Shepard and the changes in her personality. So while I could be heroic and make all the right choices right from the get-go, I actually chose to give her flaws and an actual character arc. In Mass Effect 1, I made her unquestionably loyal to her higher-ups and bad at giving speeches to the crew.
Crew, this is Commander Shepard. We have our orders. Find Saren before he finds the conduit. This is the most important mission any of us have ever been on. The fate of an entire galaxy is at stake. We will stop Saren no matter what the cost.
So when I go to Mass Effect 3 and had Shepard yelling at those above her and giving inspirational speeches, it felt so earned. So yeah, now we get into spoiler territory. After a long think about who Shepard was going to be, I decided on a soldier with a tragic background. With the colonist history, she was a survivor from the planet Mindwar, where all her friends and family had been killed by Batarian slavers. With the Alliance army coming to the rescue, she joined up at a young age and quickly rose through the ranks. But with the sole survivor path on top, she was the only one to survive the brutal mission on Akuz, where her team was killed by a giant beast. And so, with this established, I had the key points of my Shepard. She was young, a loyal soldier to the Alliance, someone who survives no matter what the cost, and someone who has watched everyone around her die, left to wonder if she deserves to be the only one left. The story begins, and I gotta get this out of the way, from start to finish, the trilogy has one of the best soundtracks of any franchise.
The Arcturus Prime relay is in range. Initiating transmission sequence. Commander?
It perfectly sets the mood right from the get-go. And speaking of setting the mood, Mass Effect 1 does an incredible job at world building. It can be very difficult to introduce players to a new world and get them invested right away. It's why we get so many sequels and franchises that share the same universe nowadays, because that hurdle of getting people to subscribe to a new world with new factions, races, sciences and such is already out of the way. Yet the first hour of Mass Effect is pretty perfect. You get this wall of text explaining the year and general context. You then immediately see the Normandy and get an idea of how advanced this galaxy is, and you witness the mass relay, explaining how humanity was able to spread across the stars. Soon the very first alien is introduced, the first planet, your first companions, and even the first Reaper. All this within 10 to 20 minutes, and yet none of it feels overwhelming. It honestly reminds me of how A New Hope introduces the Star Wars galaxy, which is unsurprising as BioWare worked on Knights of the Old Republic. At this point I was already getting immersed into the story, especially with the improved gameplay of Legendary Edition. But then I arrived at the Citadel, and this was a true turning point.
Look at the size of that ship.
The Ascension, flagship of the Citadel fleet.
I walked into this room here and talked to these fun aliens, complaining about how their kind is treated by the galaxy. I thought, that's interesting, and so I brought up the Codex. And look, I'm well aware that reading blocks of text to learn about a whole new galaxy sounds off-putting. I usually ignore this stuff in games because I'm just so used to reading boring notes scattered about, which would be way more interesting if discussed by an actual NPC. But like, the lore in Mass Effect is so fascinating. The fact BioWare made this amount of detailed history in galactic politics for a completely new IP is incredible. I just compared this game to A New Hope, and so I was expecting Mass Effect 2 to be like The Empire Strikes Back, where it takes the simple galaxy established at the start and starts filling it out with details. But no, with Mass Effect the details are all there right from the get-go. From the history of Protheans, to the formation of the Council, the Krogan Genophage, the First Contact War, and so on. So it truly feels like you've entered a living, breathing galaxy, rather than a place that looks cool but without any actual thought behind it. After taking my time on the Citadel, and spending way too long listening to the ambience, I was on the Normandy with my crew. And here's where things continued to change drastically from my original playthrough. Ashley Williams, this gunnery chief right here, represents everything I did wrong the first time round. Originally, I spoke to Ashley and quickly found out she loves humans, but has a deep distrust of aliens. And so quickly in my mind I thought, she's the xenophobic character, so if my shepherd is renegade, she'll support her, and if my shepherd is paragon, she'll bluntly disagree. And so honestly, I ignored Ashley quite a lot, because I assumed she'd be the usual one-dimensional character, who predictably at the end would be like, "I'm so sorry shepherd, I was all wrong, these aliens helped us, they're great." However, characters in Mass Effect are anything but one-dimensional. Over the game, I started talking to her every chance I got, and was hearing out her points rather than dismissing them. And after listening to her arguments, I now completely understood her character. She had a very militaristic family who was affected by the First Contact War against the Turians, and she wasn't wrong when saying every species looks out for itself, as the Council proves that time and time again. The problem in her logic is that she believes humanity should behave the same way, as why should we support other species if they don't support us? And so now I saw Ashley not as a boring character who's racist and needs to become not racist, but as a character who needs to understand that unless humans take the step in uniting all species, the galaxy is ultimately doomed. And honestly, while my shepherd trusted aliens more than her, she needed to learn the same lesson. And so by the end of the game, Ashley pretty much became Shepard's best friend, as they discussed all this stuff in a civilized manner. From this point, the way I interacted with the crew changed, and I quickly grew to love all of them. Although this does bring up one of my least favourite things from Mass Effect 1, the crew all love Shepard. Like, really love Shepard. Like after 2 conversations they are all flirting with her. And my shepherd was so nervous about commanding the Normandy and saving the galaxy that she absolutely had no desire to romance anyone. So having to turn down advances from numerous crew members was rather annoying. I even had to restart a save after a casual conversation with Kaidan somehow ended up with each of them flirting, which is not the option I thought I chose. Anyway, the next part of Mass Effect 1 I learned to love were the planetary explorations. As I said at the start, I originally livestreamed my first playthrough, and so I really tried to skip these planets as I thought they'd be boring to watch. But this kind of stuff is right up my alley. Space exploration is my favourite setting, genre, I don't know what you'd call it. Stuff like the unknown regions in Star Wars, or just travelling into the emptiness of space in 2001: A Space Odyssey. And so I loved driving around these desolate planets, picking up what I could find, and of course reading their interesting lore. Although I would understand if a lot of people didn't enjoy this part of the game, as it does slow things down considerably. As for the story, I'll refrain from describing my entire playthrough step by step, but I continue to play the character as best as possible. If someone helps Shepard and takes her warning seriously, she's kind in return. But on the flip side, if a character threatens her or stands in the way of the mission, she draws her gun and won't hesitate to fire if need be. I found that by the end my choices were about 2/3 Paragon and 1/3 Renegade, which actually didn't lock me out of any choices down the road. So surprisingly, doing a pretty neutral playthrough is completely viable. And of course, as I was saying earlier, I'm in charge of my Shepard, and so I'm also in charge of her character arc. And a key change in her character came from a moment I completely didn't expect. On board the Citadel, a young woman was threatening to end her life. It turns out she was an escapee of a slave camp, captured from Shepard's homeworld during the same raid that took her parents. My Shepard had always had survivor's guilt, and here was a victim calling out exactly what was in Shepard's head, forcing her to voice her guilt aloud. Shepard had to tell this girl to leave the past, focus on the future, and surround herself with people who will help. The girl took the advice and handed herself over to C-Sec. But that wasn't the only victory. Shepard had just basically faced her own past, and saw that someone not only survived the same raid, not only forgave Shepard for surviving, but also had the will to move on. So while Shepard's problems weren't magically fixed in one go, this moment helped her move on and remove the self-doubt she previously had. It's a great moment that comes out of nowhere, but all this character development I just mentioned wasn't BioWare's doing, it was my own. I had embraced that I was in control of this story's main character, and it was up to me to add all the details that make a character interesting. By now, I've established pretty much everything that made me fall in love with Mass Effect 1. I went to Vermeer, kept Rex alive, heard this amazing speech.
In the battle today, we will hold the line!
Saved Ashley, which was a big deal because it was the first time Shepard made a choice purely on selfish reasoning. We then went to Ilios, where Liara, the Prothean researcher, and Ashley, the Geth killer, joined me. On the Citadel, Renegade made Saren shoot himself, because Shepard was just so done with dealing with him. And finally, there was the big choice of whether or not to save the Council. And this was another big moment for my playthrough, because in the back of my mind, I knew it was best to save them. And so that's the option I chose. But you know what? I was disappointed in myself for not staying in character, so I reloaded the mission and chose again. I had a long think about what my Shepard would say, and my Shepard was so focused on destroying the Reapers that I know she'd say concentrate on Sovereign. As a player, I knew the outcome of this choice, but I was determined to tell a satisfying and consistent story, and this option was the most consistent. And I'm so glad I did that, because it meant that Shepard had a victory she wanted, but from then on had to deal with the repercussions of the Council dying. And there Mass Effect 1 ended. And while I view the trilogy as one ongoing story, this game is honestly my favourite of the three. From start to finish, I was invested in the story, the characters, and the fun of playing a flawed protagonist. I also adore the atmosphere, the sounds of the Citadel, the loneliness of planets, and the sudden sense of scale and, oh no, this is bad, when you face the Reaper. So yeah, all this set up my new way of playing through Mass Effect. With my first playthrough of the trilogy, Mass Effect 2 was the one I was most confused about. I'd seen people call it one of the best games of all time, but I found it to be the weakest of the three. From what I can remember, my main critique was the strange structure of the narrative, as it didn't really have a traditional layout of a story, but instead it was like lots of smaller stories back to back, those being the companion loyalty missions. And then, rather abruptly, I reached the final mission and it was over. Now obviously you don't need me to explain why the final mission is great, but still I felt kinda dissatisfied with the ending. But that's because I completely missed what Mass Effect 2 was about. I was expecting the start of some great battle against the Reapers. The first game had you fighting a single Reaper, and with the vast majority of storytellers, they would have made the second game feature even more Reapers as the villains. But instead the villains were these collectors, and for the first half you're just told they're connected to the Reapers in some way. I pointed at this and claimed that the game was a weak middle act, But this second time around, I realised why Mass Effect 2 wasn't some epic battle against the Reapers, because that's not the story it wanted to tell. No matter what, the Reapers were on their way, there was no stopping that. And so rather than rush to that point in the story, BioWare chose to focus almost 100% on characters. And I think Morden here explains why the choice was made.
Hard to imagine galaxy. Too many people, faceless, statistics easy to depersonalize. Good when doing unpleasant work. For this fight, want personal connection. Can't anthropomorphize galaxy, but can think of favorite nephew.
While seeing Shepard defend the galaxy is cool and all, the trilogy needed a more personal reason for the fight. And that's the purpose of Mass Effect 2. Slight tangent, but hear me out. It got me thinking about my problem with a lot of superhero movies, and plenty of games as well. Many of these stories say the world is in danger and the hero needs to save it. But I find that so boring because the world isn't some character who will make me sad when they die. So while yes, it's high stakes, it just feels impersonal, and just such a weak premise. So going back to Mass Effect 2, it could have easily focused on the arrival of the Reapers, but it went out of its way to present a plethora of incredible characters who are just so well written. And you then go on personal missions with each of them and learn about their pasts on a surprisingly intimate level. All this means is that when the time comes to face the Reapers, I don't just want to save the galaxy for, obvious reasons. I want to save it so that the crew I love have a future. Upon having this realization, I allowed myself to get fully immersed into everyone's story. And again, every character is just so well written. Take Thane for example. I imagine the writers had the idea that one of the crewmates would be an edgy expert assassin, a lone wolf with a dark past. And for so many games, that would be Thane's entire personality. But Thane is so much more than that. He's deeply religious with a need of atonement before he dies. He believes his body is nothing more than a weapon, something he doesn't want his son to become. And this perfectly represents how BioWare steers clear of stereotypes in the best possible way. I mean, how often do you have a religious character who isn't an extremist or a pacifist? Like, I'm not religious myself, but the way Thane and Ashley talk about each of their beliefs, it's handled with a level of dignity you don't usually see. And this applies to every character. Joker is more than just the cripple. Miranda is more than just the sex appeal. Morden is more than the mad scientist, and so on. So yeah, while I do honestly still have problems with the story, fully taking the time with each character ended up being a highlight of the trilogy. But speaking of story, you may have noticed my Shepard is now bold and a bit more aggressive. The boldness is because I thought it would be weird for Cerberus to be styling her hair, and the aggressiveness is because the absurd situation she's been thrown into. After being resurrected 2 years into the future, there's a lot for Shepard to be angry about. The galaxy ignored her warnings of the Reapers, some of her old crew no longer trusts her, and worst of all, the only people on her side are Cerberus, the same people who killed her squadron in the whole sole survivor backstory. So yeah, I went a little more renegade for this playthrough, and it was a lot of fun. Although obviously my Shepard wasn't fully evil, with my Paragon and Renegade being about 50-50. This choice actually affected some later decisions. For example, I couldn't stop Tally's people from exiling her, but I was completely fine with that. I mean, I felt bad for Tally, but it was showing that Shepard's new attitude was having consequences. You know, interesting character stuff. So all this, plus the new ways I played Mass Effect 1 being carried over, meant I enjoyed Mass Effect 2 way more than the first time, and I finally understand why people love it so much. Although, before moving on to Mass Effect 3, I do want to point out a couple things. First, I found the dialogue options to be sometimes a bit misleading. Like, I actually restarted the entire game after this happened.
Get to the damn shuttles! I'll haul Joker's crippled ass out of here!
I was so annoyed, like, no, I just wanted Shepard to be stern, not to suddenly become ableist out of nowhere. Secondly, and this is my biggest criticism with the game, no matter how much I tried role-playing the character, Shepard and everyone else's reaction to her being brought back from the dead is completely unreasonable. Shepard is just kinda like, whoa, 2 years? That's a long time. And then only ever jokes about it from then on. And as for everyone else, they're like, oh hey Shepard, guess you're not dead. Like, I was so excited for the reunion with Anderson, and he's just like, huh, so the rumours are true, good to see you. And then you meet Garrus, and immediately Shepard is the one asking him questions, like, why are you on Omega? It's crazy, surely Garrus would freak out, like, Shepard, my good friend, how on earth are you alive? It's honestly why I continued to enjoy Ashley as a character, because despite her being stubborn and not joining the crew, at least she has a big reaction to Shepard's return. Anyway, now that rant is over, I'll end with one more thing I learned to love. The DLC. God damn, it's so good. The Shadow Broker DLC I played right before the final mission, and it felt like Shepard's own personal loyalty mission that she'd never got to have. She helped a friend, gained a new respect for Liara, and went to the end and her possible death knowing that someone would be out there looking into stopping the Reapers. Then finally there was the Murder 300,000 Batarian DLC, which I definitely never played before, and it was wild. Seeing that 2-day countdown for the Reapers was a great moment, and I enjoyed how naturally it led into Mass Effect 3. Speaking of which... Mass Effect 3 is the big cinematic third act. There's no time for surveying planets, no time for personal missions. It's a simple countdown to save the galaxy where every mission needs to work towards that goal. While I miss the exploration of Mass Effect 1 and the personal conversations of Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect 3 creates a sense of urgency like few other games achieve. I eventually want to make another video talking about this, but storylines of an impending countdown to Doomsday usually have a big problem with urgency. An easy comparison is Fallout 4, where your child is kidnapped and you need to save him, but first you just want to make a neat settlement. Or The Witcher 3, where it's vital that Geralt finds Ciri and stops the Wild Hunt, but not before going on a treasure hunt for some sweet new armour. There's a bunch of comparisons I could make, because at the end of the day, they're all video games, and they need to be filled with stuff to do, even if the main character should logically ignore it. Yet Mass Effect 3 managed to completely avoid this problem using a few different ways. First, of course, are the war assets. It's a simple thing, but seeing that bar gradually fill after every mission, no matter how big or small, always makes you feel like you're working towards an end goal. Then there's the Crucible, the solution to all your problems that gives you a countdown that isn't really a countdown, as it only reaches the end once you reach the final missions. If the Crucible was fully built about midway, then from then on I'd feel guilty about completing missions when I know I could begin the attack on Earth. But because its construction is always ongoing, it actually makes sense to do everything you can in the galaxy. And that's exactly what I did, especially since there was this sad feeling that soon the journey would be over. Honestly, at this point, there were no new ways I was learning to love Mass Effect, but this was the game where I felt the most rewarded for my new playstyle. For spending so much time getting to know this galaxy, the weight of the Reaper's destruction felt all the heavier. For choosing to mix Paragon and Renegade, I was facing dire consequences. Like me and Legion had a relationship of distrust, to the point where Legion was clearly lying to Shepard, and so the Geth became too much of a risk in her eyes, eventually leading to the Quarians destroying their entire race. And most importantly, the time I'd spent with each crew member made each of their shining moments all the more impactful. And finally, I had my first romance with the one person who fought the Reapers from beginning to end, Liara. God, I got so attached to all these characters. I'm not someone who easily gets emotional over things. Like, I haven't cried for years, and I don't say that as a weird brag or anything, it's just how my brain and body functions. But this final moment here with Thane as he passes away, I tell ya, my eyes welled up in a way that very few games have achieved.
Guide this one, Kalahira, and she will be a companion to you as she was to me. Why did the last verse say she?
The prayer was not for him, Commander. He has already asked forgiveness for the lives he has taken. His wish was for you.
Goodbye, Thane.
It just took me so off guard. Naturally I thought Thane was praying for his own life, but he actually spent his final moments praying for Shepard. It got me so good. Then finally, I was near the end, and I faced one last consequence for my playstyle. All I had left to do was the Citadel DLC before the final 2 missions, so I took a look at my war assets, and the bar wasn't full. Now by this point, I was pretty certain I'd be going for the Destroy ending, and I knew I needed around 7,500 assets to get the ending where the Reapers are destroyed, and it's heavily implied that Shepard lives. But with only a few missions left, it seemed impossible to reach that number. So basically, in my mind I knew that Shepard wasn't making it out of this alive, and this is where I almost slipped back into my old way of playing, as I desperately searched everywhere I could for those last few war assets. I felt slightly annoyed at first, knowing I was so close, and if I'd made just 1 or 2 different choices over my entire playthrough, Shepard would live. I realised I'd completed every mission, searched every system, done everything. But then, at that point, I had a feeling of acceptance. I knew Shepard would stand by the choices she had made, and was ready to face the consequences. And so, knowing that these were her last days alive, I started up the Citadel DLC, and had one last good time with the crew. Then of course, we finally dealt with Cerberus, and only one mission remained. And alright, I'm not going to turn this into a rant about Mass Effect's ending, because Lord knows it's been talked about enough. But, with how invested I was, it filled me with all the emotions, and I look back at the ending with fondness. Hackett gives a great speech with great music. The moment where every ship in the galaxy exits the mass relay at once is just one of the most memorable moments ever. And yeah, what the final mission lacks in combat, it makes up for in atmosphere. The only thing that I find a really strange choice is having all the other companions say a brief goodbye with a hologram, like they really couldn't think of any excuse to bring them into the mission. But again, I was fully immersed at this point, and having Shepard give a full and confident speech just felt like a perfect bookend to her character.
There will be no second chances, and no room for mistakes. Each of you needs to be willing to die to win the day. Anything less, and you're already dead. But take heart. Look around you. You're not in this fight alone. We face our enemy together, and together, we will defeat them.
Then, remembering my Mass Effect 1 ending with Liara and Ashley at my side, I thought I'd bring them along for one last fight. So, I dealt with the elusive man, said a heartfelt goodbye to Anderson, and finally had the chat with Ghost Boy. It's still a jarring ending that can feel a bit random, but honestly, I think part of why I don't mind it is because I was just fully in the mind of Shepard, and my Shepard was tired and basically wanted to say, "Shut up and show me how to destroy the Reapers and I'll do the rest." And that's exactly what she did. She blew herself up and all synthetic life, not just to end the cycle, but to make sure there was a 0% chance of the Reapers resuming their harvest ever again. With that, the journey was over. The galaxy was saved, and all my choices meant that the galaxy had a hopeful future, but one that Shepard would never see. And after 180 hours in the galaxy of Mass Effect, the credits rolled. The first thing I did after that is I went to my spreadsheet where I keep track of every game I've played. I know I'm a nerd. And I moved Mass Effect Legendary Edition right into my top 10. Looking back, it's so strange to see how different my playthroughs were. Back in 2020, I got to the end and barely even thought about the 3 choices. I just chose Synthesis and the credits rolled and I was like, yeah, that was pretty good. And the Ghost Kid told me with Synthesis that we'd reach a next stage of evolution and live happily ever after, so you know, that's cool. Like, hopefully I've explained it well, but it shows how vastly different your opinions on a game can be if you allow yourself to be immersed in the world you're in. Sometimes that means reading a few pieces of lore scattered about, or it could mean you need to get into the headspace of the character, or it could even be as simple as playing in a relaxed environment. So, the next time you want to embark on another Mass Effect adventure, or delve into any other large game of similar nature, maybe don't think about optimizing your character and getting the best ending. Think about telling your own story in the headspace of your own character, and embrace the repercussions of your actions, be them right or wrong.